Well, have you ever had a job that would count as manual labor? You ever have one of those? I know increasingly, like we don't have those, right? Like increasingly people don't have to do this. Like you go to high school and then you go to college and then you go straight to some desk job somewhere and you get to work inside all the time. You rarely spend any time outside and then you become like this really pastely clear person with zero tan even in Florida. You know what I mean? Right? We're increasingly seeing that. But I think that a bunch of us have had these manual labor jobs. Now, I'm not talking about also hard work like restaurant jobs. That's very hard. I'm talking about working with your hands, doing stuff where like you're probably going to get a splinter, you might get a finger cut off, something like that. I'm talking about manual labor. My first job was a manual labor job. When I was a kid, a teenager, my parents looked at me and said, hey, if you want to have a car, if you want to have gas in that car, and if you want to have car insurance for that car, which is legally required by the state of Texas, you're going to have to pay for all of that yourself. I said, oh, that's different. That's different. I've got to figure this out. So luckily, my dad had a cousin who owned an impound yard. I don't know if you've ever been to an impound yard, but it's not exactly the Ritz. You know what I mean? It's not exactly one of those type of jobs. So my job at the impound yard, I thought, because I'm family, I'm going to get the cush job. I'm going to sit inside in this cush job in the air conditioning because it's summertime, 105 degrees outside where I'm from. And I thought for sure I'd be sitting inside crunching numbers, getting people coffee, you know, different things like that. But when I showed up, it was very different. It was very different than what I expected because they did not put me inside. There was no air conditioning where I needed to be, none of that. I had outside jobs, things like that. I was spending my time taking people to and from their cars, right? And these people were, generally speaking, fairly irate about the fact that they had to be there. And they had just paid a huge amount of money because it costs a lot of money when your car gets impounded and you have to go get it, especially the longer it sits in that impound yard. So, public service announcement here for you. If your car ever gets impounded and towed, go get it that day. It's still going to cost a lot of money, but not as much as if you wait a few days. Okay? So I would take these people to their car, and sometimes their tires would be flat. Sometimes they didn't know where their keys were, and we had to figure out a way for them. I had learned how to start vehicles without keys. I guess that means I could have been in like a car thief movie or something now. I don't know. I learned how to do all of those things. One time I had to get down and jack a car up for this older man, and because he couldn't do it. It was already hot. I felt so bad for him. And so I get down in there, and my good deed was repaid with like 1,000 fire ant bites all over my body. It hurt so bad. I thought I was going to go into anaphylactic shock for a second. Oh, man, it was outside. It was manual labor. It was good for me, though. I learned a lot of stuff. I learned how to drive a forklift. Bet you didn't know that I could do that. I learned how to drive and it was a manual, right? It wasn't even an automatic when I was learning how to do that and going up hills and doing stuff, dropping cars off of them. It was great. It was awesome. But manual labor is tough. And I want to talk about it because today is Labor Day. You may not know this. Labor Day is not just about hot dogs and taking long 3-4 day weekends, okay? That's not what it's all about. Labor Day, it was founded in the late 1800s, specifically 1894. It was signed into law by Grover Cleveland to commemorate and celebrate the workers of America. Now, at that time, leading up to that time, laborers had long been exploited. I'm talking child labor. I'm talking just regular workers in the workplace. They have to work these 12, 15-hour days sometimes just to keep going, just to keep their job and make sure they could keep feeding their families. They were struggling all the time. This was back-breaking work all the time to make ends meet. And so they got together and they started unionizing and started talking back and forth and saying, look, we can make a difference. If we'll all just work together here, we'll go on strike, we'll do this. And so sometimes they would strike. And when they decided to strike, sometimes troops got called in. And there were these massive clashes between troops and then police. And then on the other side, regular old people. And sometimes they got very bloody. But these workers kept working. And they kept striking, and they kept doing what they had to do. And eventually, they got their way. They eventually got their way. And they formed Labor Day for that very reason. But remember, these are people who were trying for years and years and years to get some semblance of help, trying to get some respite from the hard work they were always doing and being taken advantage of for. A lot of these people were Christians, just like you, maybe. A lot of these people were followers of Jesus and wanted good things for their community, and they worked really hard to make those things happen. They were upstanding citizens in their own right, and church members and deacons and even pastors. They were those type of people, a lot of them. And so their faith told them that God would take care of them. But isn't it true that a lot of times we can come into church and we can sing these songs about how God's going to take care of us, how God's going to fight for us, and how we're going to see a victory. We can sing those songs and we know it intellectually in our mind that God's going to be there for us and taking care of us. But our experience tells us that that may not be true. You keep going through life and bad times, hard times starts happening, and our experience begins to tell us it may not be true. And you don't even want to admit it to yourself. You don't want to admit it to God. You certainly don't want to admit it to anybody else around you because you're afraid that you'll be less of a Christian, less of a Jesus follower in their eyes and even in your own eyes if you admit that this is just really hard and you don't know if or when God is going to show up. I remember going through college and I woke up one morning and I said, I feel like I'm a million miles away from wherever God is. There was a lot going on in my life at that time. And I didn't really know how to handle it. And I would pray and I just felt like there was nothing. The ancient Israelites knew a lot about this. See, they were God's covenant people. And when we say covenant, sometimes our mind goes to contract, doesn't it? Like, I'm this part of the contract, and you are that part of the contract, right? And as long as I do my thing, then you're going to do your thing. And as long as you do your thing, I'm going to do my thing in this contract. That's not how covenants work, though. Like, a covenant means I'm going to always be doing my part of the covenant, whether or not you do yours. And so if you look throughout the history of Israel, especially in that Old Testament, if you look throughout the history of Israel, even though Israel turns its back on God, God is still always there, bringing them back, always working to bring them back because God has covenanted with Israel. And God is always fulfilling God's part of the covenant. Israel had made a covenant with God, and so they believed that whenever bad things happened, Whenever bad things were going on, that God was going to take care of them ultimately. Why? Because they had made a covenant with God, and God was required to do so. That God loved them. God was required to step in and do this. Now, their faith told them that God was going to take care of them, that they were going to see a victory, but their experience often told them otherwise because like you, like me, a lot of bad things still happened to them. And a lot of times, people who oppressed them, people who hurt them, people who did things to take advantage of them were not repaid. Now, here on this side of things, we think, yeah, well, there's the afterlife, right? There's but they didn't have a concept of life after this the way that we do. See, in general, most people in the West today, if you were to ask them, hey, what's the Christian view of the afterlife? They would say, well, there's a heaven and there's a hell. And the people who have given their hearts to Jesus and lived a good life, they go to heaven. Everybody else, not so much. That's the general understanding, right? In ancient Israel, it wasn't so. For them, there was this one place everybody went. It was called Sheol. And you just kind of existed there. There weren't any, streets of gold, giant mansions waiting on you if you'd been really good. It's just kind of where you existed, kind of where you were. So for them, the afterlife wasn't going to repay anyone. For them, nothing was supposed to happen with the afterlife. It was supposed to happen before that. Supposed to happen all before that. So if you did something wrong to me, then God was going to repay you soon. But what if God doesn't? What if bad things are happening to me and that's just it? Nobody gets repaid? and I still feel bad. The Israelites had a lot of songs to pass on their faith. We call them psalms today, and we read one earlier. We're going to read part of it again here in a second. And a third of those songs that are recorded from history are psalms of lament, songs to complain, psalms to cry. And they would sing these songs as worship a lot of times. I want to show you a pretty famous one. The writer says this, my God, why have you forsaken me? So let's pause for a moment. Now look, he doesn't say God way out there who has nothing to do with me. He says, my God. My God. This is my God. You are my God. We have a covenant together. You're not somebody else's deity. You are mine. I believe in you. I love you. I trust you. And since that's the case, why have you forsaken me? You ever been there? Why'd you allow this to happen to me? Why'd you allow that to happen? Why is this going on? Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? Why are you a million miles from wherever I am, God? You could step in right now and you could fix this, but you won't. Is it because you don't exist? Is it because you don't like me? Did I do something wrong? Did I say a bad word? My God, he goes on, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. I find no rest. You've been there, haven't you? Where you've been so consumed with this thing that is giving you problems, with this thing that's bringing you pain. You've been so consumed with it, you can't even rest. There's sleepless nights thinking about these things. We call this a dark night of the soul. You've been through this, I'd imagine. And so the man starts there. He says, look, you are my God. I've covenanted with you, and I feel abandoned. I feel forsaken. You are nowhere to be found. I'm crying out to you because I trust you, and nothing. But the psalmist continues to trust, doesn't he? See, the problem here is, the primary problem at least, is not that things aren't happening. It's that there's a silence from God. This God that's supposed to be speaking in. There's a silence from this God that they supposedly have a covenant with. But that's the tension. I know what my faith teaches me, but here's what I'm experiencing. But the psalmist continues to trust. And not without other people mocking and making fun. Because the second that you decide that you're going to continue to trust God, even when like everything's falling apart around you, there are going to be people who come around and come into your life who tell you to abandon that line of thought. And the same thing happened for this psalmist. Said this a little bit later. Said, but I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. He says, all who seek me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their head. Can you imagine? You're going through the lowest part of your life and people are pointing at you and laughing at you and mocking at you, telling you how dumb you are to continue thinking the way that you are. Telling you how dumb you are to continue thinking that God cares about you at all. He quotes him. He says, he trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him since he delights in him. Oh, if God loves you so much, why doesn't God do something? Maybe this reminds you of another episode later on. Jesus on the cross, hanging there. And they said, well, if you're the Son of God, make it happen, man. Let God save him. The psalmist stays strong and says this, yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From the very beginning, I have trusted in you, and it's because of you that I trust you. Not on my own, it's because of what you have done, God, that I trust you. I have covenanted with you as you have covenanted with me. And I continue to trust you, even though everything around me tells me to be unfaithful, I will be faithful. I will continue. And he makes the stand. I'm going to do this. Can I tell you this? That when you find yourself in a place where you don't know if you can be faithful any longer, you've got to continue to be faithful. But the only way you're going to do that is if you have a good foundation. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, those kids in your life need a foundation. They need a foundation. If you don't have them in church, if you don't have them in a faith community of any kind, guess what's going to happen when the world starts telling them that they should just be unfaithful, that they should just curse God and die? They're going to drift. They're going to drift away from the God of the universe. They're going to drift away from those things. You got to get them a foundation. So my advice to you is to have them here. Have them in a faith community. Have them around people. Be their faith community. Be involved in their life. Sure, like you need to do your part too at home. Do it at home, right? Read the Bible with your kids. Pray with your kids openly. Say you're sorry when you do things wrong. Model Christian behavior for them. Show them what it looks like to follow Jesus. Do all of those things with them, but partner with us. Partner with us. And if we're not the church for you, that's fine. Partner with a church somewhere, somehow. And be active in it. Because if you're not, there won't be a foundation here. And the same is true for those of you who come to faith later in life. You've got to have a foundation too. All of us, including me, we've all got to have a foundation. And if we're not spending time with God, trying to pray, trying to read our Bible, spending time in a small group, we won't have a foundation. And when those hard times come, when those difficult periods of life come, and they will, and there are people who come around us and say, hey, just curse God and die, man. God doesn't care. God isn't invested. God maybe doesn't even exist. When you hear those things coming, if you don't have a foundation, you're more susceptible to them, to those lies. But when you've got people around you who are spurring you on in the faith, when you've got people around you who are spurring you on in the faith, when you're spending time with the Lord daily, oh man, you're going to walk through that. It's going to be hard, but you're going to walk through it. That's exactly what happens with the psalmist. At the end of the psalm, he says this, I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly, I will praise you. Now, this is an assembly, right? This is an assembly. Whether you're here or online, this is an assembly. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him, revere him. All you descendants of Israel. See, the foundation that started, even though everybody was telling him to be unfaithful, this foundation kept him going. And at the end of it all, he's pushing other people back to God. And the same can be true for you and for me. Now, you maybe have heard some of these words before from the New Testament. In the accounts of Jesus' death, where he's hanging on a cross, Jesus actually quotes this. Jesus actually quotes this very psalm. He's hanging on the cross in immense and immeasurable pain. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? See, in Psalm 22, the sufferer is a human. And they're coming to grips with the terror of mortality in the absence of God. Right? This terror of mortality, especially in the absence of a God who loves and cares for you. But in Jesus' death, in the Gospels here, in the suffering of Jesus, we see God entering into and then participating in that same terror of mortality. And he identifies with the suffering, and he identifies with the dying. And because he has engaged in this type of thing, because he's engaged in that desolation and in that feeling and knows what it's like, Jesus can now give comfort to each and every one of us who are dealing with that same thing today. If you're walking through something that you feel like is unbearable, and Jesus has walked that path, Jesus can bring you comfort. Jesus knows. Jesus identifies you. He doesn't run away from it. We've all got our own stuff that we're dealing with. Maybe you've got a child who's really struggling with something. Maybe it's hard for you to go to work every day. Maybe it's something else I can't even imagine, something you've carried with you for years. Jesus knows. And Jesus will walk through it. That's why the Apostle Peter, years after Jesus' death, he writes a letter to some other Christians in a church, and he says this, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. God isn't far off. God hasn't run away. God's there. He cares for you. He cares deeply for you. And we say that so much in church now as an overcorrection to a time when we did the hellfire and brimstone messages. We say it so much that it almost becomes trite. But I want you to try to wrap your mind around this truth, that the God of the universe who created stars and planets and things we could never imagine loves you, cares for you. Oh, man. I don't know about you, but I am not that special. But for some reason, God thinks I am, and God thinks you are. You may have heard in our little community over the last week, we've had 2 sudden deaths of teenagers. And that, in and of itself, is heartbreaking, isn't it? Just heartbreaking. I was meeting with a friend this last week, and they said, I don't know what to tell my kids about that. This came to mind. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Because the truth is, God does not run from grief. God embraces those in its grip. And there are people all around our church at this very moment, people who are walking through so much grief. There are families who have lost children. There are people, we know from COVID that there's thousands and thousands who've been dying. We know there's people who are sad because they can't even see their family right now. We know all of these things. We know that people are walking through all sorts of stuff right now. And when they ask where God is, you say, God doesn't run from grief. God embraces those in its grip. And Jesus coming to earth is the proof. Jesus didn't have to go to the cross. Jesus chose to go to the cross for you and for me because he cares for us. So 2 things I think we can remember as a result of this bottom line. I want you to remember this, but there's 2 things that I think are informed by this that we want to remember. The first is this, that God has not forsaken us. God's not forsaken us. God is there. God is with us. God may be quiet. God may be waiting on us to settle down. What really happens a lot of times in my experience is that I'm expecting God to act in one way. And so while I'm expecting God to act in one way and God's not doing that because God's doing something else, it feels to me as if God isn't moving. But that's a me problem, see. What's actually happening is God's doing something I can't quite fathom yet. God has the bigger picture in mind and God is working. My job is to trust. My job is to continue to trust and keep going. The second thing is we must embody God's comfort to others. We have to embody God's comfort to others. We must be the embodiment of God's comfort for those who are grieving. There's people all around you grieving. We already said it. What if you were the embodiment of God's comfort for them? What if you were the embodiment of God's comfort for them? And here's what I mean. People grieving, walking through stuff, that you're the person who shows up. You're the person who shows up. You're the one who gives them a call. Say, hey, can I take you to lunch? Hey, I'm really thinking about you, really praying for you. And if you're not good on the phone, just, send a text, maybe write a note. People love getting notes in the mail, man. Just write a note, send a letter of encouragement. What if you were that peace for them? Because friends, you have heard this enough. You are the hands and the feet of Jesus in this world. Go and be that for them. That's what we're called to. It's only when we're confident that God hasn't forsaken us and when we're going out and we are the embodiment of comfort for others that we're going to be able to sing when it's raining, right? That we're going to be able, in the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, to continue to say, I trust you, God. I'm with you. Whatever you need, whatever you want. So, as we end our time together, may you always know that God has never and will never forsake you. May you be the presence of Jesus for people who feel like Jesus doesn't like them anymore. May you be God's representative for those who are grieving. May you be the presence of Jesus for those who feel forsaken by him. And may you always know that you are loved by God and by this church, no matter what. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you for today, and I thank you that you allow us to be loved by you, that you care for us as a good, good Father. I pray for those who are hurting today, that they would feel your peace. I pray that we as your people, your covenant people, would stand strong when hard times hit. But I also pray that you would help us to embody your presence in their lives of those who are hurting. Help us to be the people you've called us to be. In Jesus' name, amen.